A quiet summer night on a small island, a promising young woman with a bright future, a powerful political figure whose decisions would echo for decades. What began as a friendly gathering ended in one of the most controversial cases in modern American history. In this episode, we dive deep into the Chappaquiddick incident, a moment that changed the course of public trust, politics, and the life of a woman who should have had a future ahead of her. Step by step, we'll uncover how an ordinary evening became the center of national attention, the timeline of that night, the discovery that shocked an entire community, the forensic findings that raised more questions than answers, and the courtroom drama that kept millions on edge. This is not just a story about one event. It's a story about power, responsibility, and the consequences that follow when silence lasts too long. If you love real true crime stories told with depth, detail, and respect, this episode will grip you until the very last second. Watch carefully. Every minute matters. Dear viewers, in the next video releases you will find very intriguing and confusing cases. And in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. Mary Jo was born in Pennsylvania in March 1940 to a middle-class Catholic family. Her childhood was not marked by any major events. It was quiet and orderly, filled with study, parish life, and traditional family values. From an early age, her parents instilled in their daughter a love of education and perseverance. But most importantly, they instilled in her a belief in the value of hard work and honesty. Her classmates remembered her as someone who always listened but rarely interrupted, a girl with an easy smile and an inner confidence who didn't need grand words to be heard. After graduating from high school, Mary Jo enrolled at Misericordia College, a private Catholic school for women. There, she studied education and literature. But the most important thing wasn't just the lectures, it was how she seized every opportunity to develop. Even as a student, she demonstrated a keen ability to articulate thoughts, write texts, and analyze the world around her. She didn't participate in violent protests or seek radical solutions. Her path was different. She believed that true progress comes through consistent, intelligent, and persistent work. After graduating from college, she moved to Washington, D.C., a city in the early 1960s that was rife with change. It was a tense time. The world was on the brink of change, politically, socially, and culturally. For a young woman with ambition and a belief in democratic values, this was a place where she could find her calling. Mary Jo took a job as a teacher, but quickly realized she wanted to be closer to the processes that shape policy and influence society. And so, she soon began working in a field that remained closed to many women at the time: political campaigns. She began as a humble assistant, handling documents, speeches, and preparing materials. But her talent was obvious. She knew how to write texts that weren't just persuasive, they sounded sincere. She knew how to translate complex political ideas into simple, understandable language, and she did so with rare precision. This quality was quickly noticed, and she soon became part of Senator Robert Kennedy's team. For a young woman from a small family, joining the inner circle of one of the country's most influential figures was more than just a career move. It was recognition of her talent and hard work. On Robert Kennedy's campaign, she was responsible for preparing speeches, processing information, coordinating between departments, and crafting the candidate's precise, measured tone. Colleagues remembered her as someone who didn't raise her voice, but always achieved the desired result. She didn't strive to be photographed alongside politicians or to become the face of the campaign. Instead, she worked in the shadows, where real ideas are born, where every paragraph, every word of a speech passes through dozens of hands and eyes to ensure it sounds just right. She was respected for her intelligence, precision, and ability to make decisions without unnecessary fuss. She belonged to a group of young women whom journalists would later call the Kennedy Girls, professional campaign staffers who formed an important, yet often unnoticed part of the political machine. Working on Robert Kennedy's campaign was a time of great hope for Mary Jo. The country was filled with the energy of change, a belief that politics could be honest and that words could change reality. She didn't work for money or personal gain. She worked for an idea. When Robert Kennedy spoke, many didn't realize that some of his speeches were written by people like Mary Jo, those who imbued every line with meaning and heart. But at the same time, life in Washington wasn't easy. It was an environment where politics and personal connections were closely intertwined, where every word could have consequences and every mistake could be costly. Mary Jo knew how to navigate this environment calmly and professionally. She wasn't a person of scandal or intrigue. She was respected for her poise and restraint. After the tragic assassination of Robert Kennedy in 1968, she, like many who worked on his campaign, experienced a profound internal crisis. He was a man they believed in not just as a politician, but as a symbol of hope. The loss of this figure became personal. Many left politics, but Mary Jo remained in Washington's orbit. She refused to give up. Despite the pain and disappointment, she continued to believe that her work had not been in vain. She began collaborating with other initiatives, participating in local political and social projects that required her skills, writing, analysis, and coordination. She was known as a reliable person who could be entrusted with responsible work. She didn't like to talk about herself, but if anyone inquired about her views, they heard a clear stance. She believed in fairness, equal opportunity, and that real change comes not through loud slogans, but through hard work. By the late 1960s, Mary Jo was well known in Washington political circles, not as a celebrity, but as the person without whom the machine wouldn't work. She lived a quiet, modest life. Colleagues described her as friendly but somewhat reserved. She didn't seek out raucous parties, although she did attend professional meetings and receptions. At such events, she didn't try to steal the spotlight, but she was still noticed for her clarity of thought, the confidence with which she spoke about politics, and her rare combination of gentleness and strength. Her friends recalled that she loved going to the seaside, reading and writing letters. At the time, this was an important way to maintain connections. She closely followed the news, analyzed the political agenda, and often argued with friends about what a just world should look like. She was no naive dreamer. On the contrary, her faith in change was based on an inside knowledge of the system. By this time, Mary Jo's life was shaping into a stable, if quiet, career. She belonged to a generation of women who were forging paths into previously male-dominated fields. Her participation in Kennedy's campaigns, her work on speeches, her presence in the behind-the-scenes processes of politics, all of this made her part of an important historical transformation. By the early summer of 1969, she was 28 years old, a young, energetic, intelligent woman who knew what she wanted. She didn't seek wealth or fame. She simply walked her path, quietly, precisely, and confidently. Those who knew her recalled that she possessed a rare quality, the ability to see politics not just as a game of interests, but as a tool for real change. She maintained connections with colleagues from Robert Kennedy's campaign. These connections weren't casual. They were people united by a shared belief in progress and justice. After the tragic events of the previous year, they tried to stick together, a kind of informal community where they found support and understanding. In Washington in the late 1960s, women had a difficult time. Politics was a tough, male-dominated field, and even the most talented female staffers often remained behind the scenes. But Mary Jo managed to earn respect not through outward charisma, but through her professionalism. And this respect was felt in the way her colleagues treated her and the way they listened to her. She could have continued her career, risen higher, and taken key positions within the apparatus. But she was more interested in substance than titles. In conversations with those close to her, she repeatedly said that she wanted her work to have meaning. She wasn't looking for a position, but for the opportunity to be part of something bigger. During that period, she often participated in informal gatherings of former Kennedy campaign staffers who discussed policy, the future of the country, and simply supported each other. It was a time of hope and uncertainty, a time when they were seeking new paths for themselves after the symbol of their movement had passed away. By then, Mary Jo Kopechne was a woman of clear values, a strong character, and a sterling reputation. She wasn't a celebrity, but she was respected. She didn't lead rallies, but her voice carried weight among professionals. She was one of those who kept the system in balance, a quiet, unnoticed, but crucial link. There were no high-profile scandals in her life. She didn't strive for extravagance, and she didn't move in bohemian circles. She lived simply, with restraint, and a clear understanding of her goals. Her biography is the story of a woman who chose to serve ideas rather than ambitions. And this is precisely what makes her so significant, not because she stood on stage, but because she was part of those who created that stage. She believed in politics not as a tool for personal success, but as a mechanism through which to change the lives of others. And this conviction determined her every step. In the eyes of her friends and colleagues, she was reliable, kind, and intelligent. In the eyes of history, she became a symbol of a generation that believed in the possibility of change. By the summer of 1969, Mary Jo was full of plans. Her professional life was moving confidently. She maintained important connections, and she never lost faith in the meaning of her work. She remained simply a young woman who lived her life, believed in her ideals, and followed her chosen path. The evening of July 18, 1969, began as an entirely ordinary evening for a small, secluded spot on the map, Chappaquiddick Island, located off the coast of Massachusetts, opposite the town of Edgerton. Summer nights here were quiet and warm, and the air, scented with the sea and grass, seemed almost still. For locals, it was a time of calm and tranquility. For politicians and their entourage, it was a chance to unwind far from the cameras and bustle of Washington. That evening, a small but very special group gathered on the island, not random guests, but people united by a shared past. They were bound by the fact that they had all once worked on Robert Kennedy's team. After his death, this bond did not disappear. On the contrary, it became a kind of quiet brotherhood, a place of remembrance and simultaneously an attempt to move on. The house where the meeting was held stood near the water. It was a modest cottage in typical New England style, a white facade, a wooden veranda, surrounded by shrubs and low trees. Inside, the lights were on, and voices, laughter, and music echoed. It wasn't a raucous party, but rather a friendly evening attended by about a dozen people. Among them were several women who had worked on Kennedy's campaign staff and a few men close to political circles. The center of attention, as often happened, was Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, the younger brother of President John F. Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy. He had come to the island to participate in the traditional sailing regatta, and the evening with former campaign staffers served as an informal continuation of those events. Mary Jo Kopechne was also among the guests. For her, it was an opportunity to meet friends and colleagues with whom she had worked for years, and perhaps recapture the atmosphere that once filled their lives with meaning. The evening passed quietly. Guests laughed, discussed the past, talked about politics, and how the country had changed since the tragic events of the previous year. No loud pronouncements, no heated arguments, just quiet nostalgia, the sea breeze, and a summer that seemed endless. By 10 o'clock that evening, most of the guests were still inside. The light was on the veranda, and light conversation could be heard inside. Around this time, Ted Kennedy announced he was going to take Mary Jo back to the ferry, from where she could get to the hotel on the mainland where she was staying with her friends. There was no regular service on the island after midnight, and anyone wanting to leave late in the evening had to catch the last ferry. But, as would later be established, the last ferry had already departed long ago. Kennedy and Kopechne left the house unnoticed by most of the guests. No one paid it much attention, Some thought they were just taking a stroll, others assumed he was taking her to the ferry. The senator's car, a black 1967 Oldsmobile, was parked next to the house. The island's roads were narrow and unlit, covered in gravel, and the dike bridge leading to the ferry terminal was a wooden structure without railings. For those who didn't know the route thoroughly, driving across it in the dark was risky. Around midnight, the island fell silent. In the house where the party was taking place, some were getting ready for bed, others were still talking. No one knew that a few hundred meters away, on a narrow strip of road, events would unfold that would forever change the country's political history. Kennedy's car drove along the road toward the bridge. There were no streetlights or other sources of light, only darkness and the occasional glimmer of moonlight. The wooden bridge was narrow, barely wide enough for the car to cross it without swerving. At some point, the car took a wrong turn. In an instant, the wheels skidded off the bridge. The car, without slowing down, fell into the pond, flipping over and ending up underwater. It was a tidal pond, several meters deep. The car sank quickly. The senator extricated himself from the car and made it to shore, but Mary Jo remained inside. The events that followed still raise many questions, but it's important to record only the officially established facts. After the car crashed, no one called the police. No one ran to the house, no one raised the alarm. The island was quiet. The night wore on. Around 11 o'clock the next morning, the island was already living its normal life. The sun was rising, the water near the bridge was calm, and local fishermen were going about their business as usual. It was one of them who first noticed something unusual. Underwater, at the bottom of the pond, the outline of an overturned car was visible. For the quiet island, this was a rare and alarming sign. A man who spotted a strange shadow on the seabed reported it to local police. The situation quickly became serious. The local police station in Edgerton was small, and such incidents were extremely rare. Within minutes, police and rescuers were dispatched to the scene. When the first patrol officers arrived at the dike bridge, they discovered an obvious sight: a car lying upside down underwater. The water was clear enough that even from the surface, the car's body could be seen. Rescuers immediately began a recovery operation. Divers were called in, and coordination began. A small group of locals quickly gathered around. Such incidents on the island quickly became public knowledge. While the police were trying to determine the car's owner, a diver descended into the water. The car was old and heavy, and raising it quickly proved difficult. A slight current persisted, complicating the work. However, the diver soon managed to peer inside. In those moments, a tense silence reigned on the bridge. No one knew exactly what they would find, but when the diver surfaced, his face turned pale. Inside the car was the body of a woman. It would later be identified as Mary Jo Kopechny. Her position in the car led experts to believe she had not lost consciousness immediately after the fall. But this would be the subject of further discussion and examination. Additional forces were called to the scene. The standard procedure began, cordoning off the area, completing paperwork, and documenting the situation. Journalists were still unaware of the incident, and local residents standing to the side conversed in whispers. When the car was recovered from the water, it became clear it belonged to Senator Ted Kennedy. This came as a shock to everyone at the scene. The presence of such a well-known figure's car lent the incident a whole new dimension. Authorities acted with restraint, but quickly. Information began to pour into the city, and then into state agencies. The car was slowly pulled onto the shore. Against the tranquil New England landscape, the scene seemed harsh and inexorable. The metal hull gleamed in the sun, and a ringing silence hung in the air. The island, which had been alive with ordinary life that morning, had now become the epicenter of events that would soon be the talk of the nation. The discovery of Mary Jo's body marked the finale of this quiet night, which had begun as a friendly evening. The whole world would soon know her name. But at that moment on Dyke Bridge, everything was simultaneously simple and terrifying. The overturned car, the cold water, the confused faces of the police, and the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Everything else, theories, explanations, investigations, would come later. For now, only the fact, the car, the bridge, and the body of the young woman whose life ended on that warm July night. The investigation began not with grandiose statements, but with a cold, almost mundane sense that something far beyond a mere accident had occurred on this small island. Within hours of the discovery of Mary Jo Kopechny's car and body, the Dyke Bridge and surrounding area had become a makeshift emergency room. Police cars, forensic vans, Coast Guards, journalists, and countless others stood around, simply in disbelief that such a quiet spot had become the center of a drama that would soon shake the entire country. Investigators first meticulously documented the scene. The car was upside down, the windshield was cracked, and the interior was filled with water and sand. All the doors were closed, which drew special attention from investigators. If a passenger or driver had attempted to escape, the doors would have been open or at least damaged. But there were no signs of a struggle with the locks. The Dyke Bridge's design had long been known to be dangerous, narrow, without railings, and with a wooden deck that easily confused drivers in the dark. However, the fact that the car ended up in the water didn't answer the main question: what happened after the fall? Mary Jo's body was taken to the local morgue in Edgerton. The small courthouse and police station were overflowing with journalists, and to avoid pressure, forensic experts decided to work as discreetly as possible. At this stage, the most important task was establishing the exact cause of the tragedy. Official documents stated that she died by drowning. However, experts noted that Mary Jo's lungs retained traces of breathing after the car entered the water. This observation became a turning point in the investigation. It raised a painful but important question. Could her life have been saved if help had arrived in time? No signs of violence were found on the body. This confirmed the assumption that the death was not the result of a direct attack. However, the circumstances of the tragedy, the delay in reporting, the lack of attempts to save the passenger, and the driver's erratic behavior made this case not just a tragedy, but a potential crime, especially considering who was behind the wheel. While forensic experts were examining the body, investigators began analyzing the car itself. There were no traces of anyone else on the seats, dashboard, or doors except for 2 fingerprints, Kennedy's and Mary Jo's. The seat belts were not fastened. A purse containing Kopechny's personal belongings, a passport, cosmetics, and keys, was found on the front seat. The passenger door itself showed no signs of attempted exit. All these details formed a picture that provided no clear answers but raised many questions. Particularly noteworthy was the time that elapsed between the accident and the call to the police. It was established that the car ended up in the water around midnight, and the accident report wasn't received until around 10 a.m. During those 10 hours, no one called for help or reported what had happened, and this fact became the focus of the investigation. Why didn't the person in the car report the incident? Why didn't anyone attempt a rescue operation that night, when there was still a chance of pulling the passenger out alive? Edgerton police knew this was no ordinary traffic accident. From the first hours, it became clear the case involved an influential senator. This meant that every step of the investigation would be closely scrutinized by the press and federal agencies. A regular provincial police force found itself embroiled in a high-profile political investigation. Shortly after the body was discovered, Ted Kennedy himself showed up at the station. His appearance immediately sparked a wave of interest from journalists, although no official statement was made at the time. According to eyewitnesses, he appeared tired, confused, and somewhat distant. The initial interrogations were conducted in a closed room, and the transcripts of these interviews would later become the subject of heated debate. Kennedy claimed the incident was a tragic accident. He claimed he was driving too fast on a narrow road, made a wrong turn, and went off a bridge. After the fall, he got out of the car and tried to help Mary Jo, but was unable to open the door. He then claimed to have left the scene of the accident in shock, reached home, and decided not to report the incident immediately. His explanations for why he didn't call for help were unconvincing. Investigators meticulously recorded every detail of his story. He claimed to have tried to dive and rescue the girl, but there was no physical evidence of this. His clothing showed no signs of prolonged immersion in the water, and a medical examination revealed no signs of hypothermia, scratches, or other injuries typical of intense rescue efforts. All of this heightened suspicion. At the same time, the first headlines began to appear in the media. At first, they were restrained, then increasingly insistent. Kennedy's name automatically lent the story a certain scale. Locals, previously observing the quiet life of the island, now saw television vans, reporters, photographers, and lawyers arriving at Chappaquiddick. Of particular interest were the results of the medical report, which mentioned the possibility that Mary Jo could have survived for a significant period after the fall. This meant that the delay in calling for help could have effectively cost her her life. This detail became a key turning point in the case. Investigators questioned all the party guests. Their testimonies varied in detail, but they agreed on one thing. No one knew what happened after Kennedy and Copenny left the house. No one heard the sounds of the crash. No one saw him return. A technical analysis of the car was soon conducted. Mechanics working on site determined that the car had been in good working order up until the crash. There were no signs of brake or steering failure. This ruled out the possibility of unavoidable technical failure. Therefore, only human error or other more complex circumstances remained. Suspicions were further heightened by the fact that after the crash, Kennedy did not address any of the party guests, did not call the police, and did not report the incident until the morning. Instead, he spent the night at a hotel and only reported the accident the following morning. This behavior did not fit the typical reaction of someone witnessing a tragedy. Investigators began to consider the possibility of a deliberate cover-up. This didn't lead to murder charges, but it raised questions about leaving the scene, the delay in reporting, and a possible attempt to mitigate the consequences. Meanwhile, a team of lawyers with ties to the Kennedy family arrived in Edgerton. They took on the responsibility of coordinating the senator's communications with law enforcement. This added a political tinge to the investigation. A simple traffic accident was rapidly turning into a high-profile federal investigation. The medical examiner confirmed that there were no signs of foul play. The cause of death was drowning, caused by the car slowly sinking into the water. This meant that the girl didn't die instantly after the fall. She remained alive long enough to have had timely assistance to save her. This conclusion shocked not only the investigators, but also the public when it became known. Each new day of the investigation brought new details. Investigators compared witness statements, analyzed the timeline of events, and checked the senator's phone calls and movements. Mounting evidence indicated that Kennedy's official story didn't explain key timeframes. During re-examination, the senator admitted that he hadn't reported the incident immediately because he was in shock and not thinking rationally. However, investigators noted inconsistencies between his first and second interviews. Some details of his story changed. By the end of the week, it became clear that the case could not be closed without formal charges. Authorities couldn't ignore the fact that the delay in reporting the tragedy could have directly impacted Mary Jo's outcome. Early the following week, Senator Edward Kennedy was formally arrested on charges of leaving the scene of an accident. Not murder, but a serious felony, especially given the public outcry. As he was escorted out of the police station, dozens of reporters flashed their lights on his face. There was no bravado or public tears. He was a man caught in the eye of a storm that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Kennedy's arrest marked the moment when a private tragedy finally became a public affair. Now, Not only the senator's name was at stake, but also the credibility of an entire political dynasty. Thus concluded the first stage of the investigation. Ahead lay the trial, public debate, theories, controversies, and questions. However, by this point, the story of Mary Jo Kopechne had ceased to be a local incident and had become one of the most discussed and controversial cases of its time. The trial for the death of Mary Jo Kopechne was more than just a legal matter. It became one of the most discussed and controversial events of the late 1960s in the United States. From the first days after the tragedy, public attention to the story grew exponentially. Interest in the case was fueled not only by the circumstances of the night itself, but also by the identity of the man behind the wheel of the car, Senator Ted Kennedy, the younger brother of two of the country's most influential politicians of the 20th century. In the first weeks after the discovery of the car and Mary Jo's body, the press focused primarily on the senator's failure to report the incident to the police within 10 hours. This fact raised numerous questions, both among investigators and the general public. Why didn't he call immediately? Why didn't he seek help from someone present on the island? And most importantly, could a timely call have saved the young woman's life? These questions would not just provide context, but also underpin the entire trial. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. This was no ordinary trial. In the dock sat a man of enormous political clout, a representative of a family that symbolized an entire era for many Americans. Journalists from around the world lingered outside the court, and every detail, every word, every movement of the defendant became headlines. Reporters recorded testimony minute by minute, and radio stations and newspapers instantly disseminated the news. Ted Kennedy appeared composed, but subdued during the first hearings. He understood that his every move would be interpreted in millions of homes across the country. His lawyers carefully constructed a defense based on the idea that what had happened was a tragic accident, not a deliberate act. From the outset, the defense sought to emphasize that the senator had no malicious intent and that his behavior after the accident was the result of shock and confusion. At one of the first hearings, he made a formal confession. He was driving the car at the time of the accident. He also admitted leaving the scene and not reporting the incident to the police until the morning. This confession made a strong impression on the courtroom. The press noted that he spoke quietly, reservedly, and almost emotionlessly. Defense lawyers attributed this to deep internal trauma and shock. The key point of the trial was the discussion of this 10-hour period, from the car crash into the water to the call to the police. The prosecution insisted that these actions, or more accurately, inactions, demonstrated negligence, costing Mary Jo her life. The defense, on the contrary, argued that the senator was in a state of psychological shock, unable to adequately assess the situation and act quickly. For the court and the public, this dispute was not just legal, but moral. The question was, could he have saved the girl if he had called for help immediately? And if so, is he responsible? During the hearing, witnesses from the party were questioned. Some claimed they didn't see Kennedy and Kopechne leave the house. Others recalled his behavior that night and in the hours that followed. The testimony was contradictory, but one thing was consistent. No one knew about the incident until the morning. Testimony from experts, forensic experts, divers, and autoforensic specialists, was also heard. Their task was to provide the court with a clear picture of what happened that night. This is where the forensic evidence came to the fore. The car could have been discovered and recovered much earlier if information about the crash had been received immediately. This, according to prosecutors, created the basis for a charge of negligence. Particular attention was drawn to the moment when Kennedy himself addressed the public with a statement, not in the courtroom, but via television. This address became one of the most discussed of his career. In it, he expressed deep regret, accepted moral responsibility, and attributed his behavior to shock. He uttered a phrase that would be quoted for years, that he could not explain why he had not reported the incident immediately. This admission provoked a strong reaction. Some interpreted his words as sincerity, others as an attempt to soften public condemnation. During the hearings, the parties exchanged legal arguments, but over all this hung a larger question. How would justice deal with a member of a political dynasty whose name the entire country knew? Public opinion was divided. Some demanded the harshest punishment, believing that the law should be the same for everyone, while others saw the incident as a tragic accident for which he had already paid a personal price. Ted Kennedy's behavior in court was closely monitored by the press. He didn't contest the charge of driving and failing to report the accident. Instead, his lawyers focused on the classification of the crime. A charge of negligent driving resulting in death could have carried a serious prison sentence. However, the defense insisted that what happened was not an intentional act, but a tragic coincidence. When prosecutors were given the floor, they focused on the very fact of the delay in reporting the incident. "Every minute could have been crucial," said one of them. This phrase became the front-page headline of several newspapers the next day. The prosecutors sought to demonstrate that the delay cost Mary Jo's life, and therefore the defendant bore actual responsibility. But the defense had its own argument. They presented medical evidence showing that it was impossible to determine the time of death with absolute certainty. This gave them room to argue that even if help had arrived immediately, no one could say with certainty that the outcome would have been different. This moment became a key one in the trial, shifting the focus from direct responsibility to the realm of speculation. Toward the end of the trial, the tension in the courtroom was growing. This wasn't just a case about an accident. It was a question of how the justice system would react when a person with a famous name was in the dock. The judge listened carefully to both sides, emphasizing in his speech that the decision should be based not on emotion, but on facts. The verdict was announced in July 1969. Senator Ted Kennedy was found guilty of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. However, the sentence was lenient: 2 months probation and a 1-year suspension of his driver's license. The court took into account his guilty plea, his cooperation with the investigation, and his lack of intent. This verdict sparked a heated public debate. Some called it a symbol of inequality before the law, while others called it the result of a compromise between the law and political reality. Ted Kennedy himself, speaking after the trial, said he accepted the verdict and intended to take responsibility. However, he also emphasized that the tragedy would remain with him for the rest of his life. Although he avoided actual prison time, the Chappaquiddick case became a dark page in his biography and forever changed his political destiny. From that moment on, the name of Mary Jo Kopechne will forever remain an integral part of the Kennedy family history. And this trial is one of the most powerful symbols of how a personal tragedy can become an event of national significance. The verdict was announced, and for many it was not so much the end as the beginning of a long debate about what constitutes justice and whether the law applies equally to everyone.